Hashtag stranded behind enemy lines and left for dead. She walked home against all odds. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan landscape as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical gear one final time. The 32-year-old intelligence officer from Montana had volunteered for this reconnaissance mission deep into Taliban-controlled territory, despite knowing the extreme risks involved. Her commanding officer had made it clear that this was a voluntary assignment, one that could determine the success of a major operation plan for the following month. Sarah's team consisted of 4 experienced soldiers: Sergeant Rodriguez, a communications specialist from Texas; Corporal Johnson, a medic from Ohio; Private First Class Williams, a demolitions expert from Georgia; and Staff Sergeant Thompson, their team leader with over 15 years of combat experience. They had worked together for 8 months, developing the kind of trust that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile territory. The mission briefing had been straightforward, but dangerous. Intelligence suggested that a high-value Taliban commander was operating from a compound approximately 60 miles northeast of their forward operating base. The team's objective was to conduct surveillance, gather photographic evidence, and report back on enemy movements and fortifications. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by rugged mountains, making it an ideal hideout, but also a potential trap for anyone attempting to approach it. Sarah checked her equipment methodically. Her backpack contained enough food and water for 3 days, emergency medical supplies, a satellite communication device, night vision equipment, and her personal weapon along with extra ammunition. She also carried a small notebook where she planned to record detailed observations about enemy positions and activities. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders, knowing that the intelligence they gathered could save countless lives in future operations. The helicopter insertion went smoothly. The pilot, a seasoned warrant officer named Chief Martinez, had flown countless missions into dangerous territory. He brought the aircraft down in a small clearing about 10 miles from their target, keeping the engines running while the team quickly disembarked. The rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris as Sarah and her teammates grabbed their gear and moved toward the tree line. Martinez gave them a thumbs up through the cockpit window. The plan was simple. The team would conduct their surveillance mission over the next 48 hours, then return to this exact location for extraction at 0800 hours on the 3rd day. If they missed the pickup window, Martinez would return every 24 hours at the same time for the next week before considering the mission failed. The sound of the helicopter faded quickly as it disappeared over the mountains, leaving the 5 soldiers alone in enemy territory. The silence that followed felt heavy and oppressive. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat as she scanned the surrounding terrain through her binoculars, looking for any signs of enemy movement or observation posts that might have spotted their insertion. Staff Sergeant Thompson gathered the team around him for a final briefing. His weathered face showed the strain of multiple combat deployments, but his voice remained calm and steady. He reviewed their route to the target, established communication protocols, and reminded everyone of the rules of engagement. They were there to observe, not to fight, unless absolutely necessary for survival. The trek toward the compound began immediately. The terrain was brutal, consisting of rocky slopes, deep ravines, and thick vegetation that seemed designed to slow their progress. Sarah felt the weight of her pack with each step, but she had trained for months to build the endurance necessary for extended missions like this one. The team moved in tactical formation, with Thompson taking point and Williams covering their rear. After 6 hours of difficult hiking, they reached an observation post that Thompson had identified on satellite imagery before the mission. The position offered excellent views of the valley below, while providing good concealment among the rocks and scrub brush. Sarah set up her camera equipment and began photographing the compound, which appeared even more heavily fortified than intelligence reports had suggested. The Taliban fighters had constructed multiple defensive positions around the main buildings, including what appeared to be mortar emplacements and heavy machine gun nests. Sarah counted at least 30 armed men moving around the compound, far more than the intelligence estimates of 10 to 15 fighters. She made detailed notes about the defensive positions while Rodriguez established communication with their base to report their safe arrival at the observation post. As darkness fell, the team settled into their surveillance routine. They would maintain constant observation of the compound in rotating shifts, with 2 soldiers always on watch while the others rested. Sarah took the first watch with Johnson, studying the compound through night vision equipment and noting patterns in the enemy's movement and security procedures. The compound came alive after dark. Sarah observed vehicles arriving and departing at regular intervals, suggesting that this location served as more than just a hideout for a single commander. The level of activity indicated that it might be a regional headquarters or supply depot for Taliban operations in the area. This discovery significantly increased the intelligence value of their mission, but it also suggested that the enemy presence was much stronger than anticipated. During her 4-hour watch, Sarah documented the arrival of 3 pickup trucks loaded with armed fighters and what appeared to be ammunition and supplies. She photographed license plates and tried to identify specific individuals among the Taliban fighters, hoping that intelligence analysts back at base could use the images to build a better picture of the enemy's organizational structure. When Williams relieved her at 0200 hours, Sarah felt satisfied with the progress they had made. The intelligence they were gathering would be invaluable for planning future operations. She settled into her sleeping bag, using her backpack as a pillow, and tried to get some rest despite the adrenaline that still coursed through her system. The second day brought new challenges. A patrol of Taliban fighters passed within 100 meters of their observation post around noon, forcing the team to remain perfectly still for nearly an hour while the enemy soldiers moved through the area. Sarah held her breath as one of the Taliban fighters stopped directly below their position and appeared to be scanning the rocky slope where they were hidden. The fighter carried an AK-47 assault rifle and wore a traditional Afghan outfit with a tactical vest. He seemed to sense that something was wrong, taking several minutes to study the terrain before finally moving on to catch up with his patrol. Sarah realized how vulnerable their position was if the enemy decided to conduct a thorough search of the area. Rodriguez managed to establish contact with their base during the afternoon, reporting their observations and requesting guidance about the increased enemy presence. The response was immediate and concerning. Intelligence had picked up Taliban radio chatter suggesting that enemy forces were aware of increased coalition activity in the region and were actively searching for infiltrators. Thompson gathered the team for a hurried conference. The situation had become significantly more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. They had gathered valuable intelligence about the compound and its activities, but continuing the mission for another full day might expose them to unacceptable risks. The decision was made to complete their current observations and prepare for early extraction. Sarah worked feverishly to photograph and document everything she could see from their position. She identified what appeared to be a senior Taliban commander arriving at the compound in an armored vehicle, accompanied by a large security detail. The man's arrival seemed to trigger increased activity throughout the compound, with guards taking additional defensive positions and vehicles being moved to more secure locations. As evening approached, Rodriguez attempted to contact base again to arrange for early extraction. The satellite communication device crackled with static, but no response came through clearly. He tried different frequencies and adjusted the antenna several times, but the communication links seemed to be failing. This was exactly the kind of equipment failure that could turn a dangerous mission into a disaster. The team faced a critical decision. They could attempt to return to the original extraction point and hope that Martinez would arrive as scheduled the following morning, or they could try to find an alternative route out of the area. Both options carried significant risks, especially with Taliban patrols actively searching the region. Thompson decided they would move toward the extraction point during the night, traveling slowly and carefully to avoid detection. The journey would take most of the night, but it would position them for the scheduled pickup at 0800 hours. Sarah packed her equipment quickly, making sure that all the intelligence materials were secure in waterproof containers. The night movement began at 2,000 hours. The team moved in single file, with Thompson navigating using GPS coordinates and his map. The terrain was even more challenging in darkness, despite their night vision equipment. Sarah found herself struggling to maintain the pace while carrying her heavy pack and camera equipment, but she knew that falling behind could endanger the entire team. 3 hours into their movement, disaster struck. Williams, who was walking point behind Thompson, suddenly raised his hand in the halt signal. Through the darkness, Sarah could see the glow of lights moving toward them from multiple directions. Taliban search teams were conducting a sweep of the area, and the American patrol had walked directly into their path. Thompson made a split-second decision that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. He whispered urgent instructions for the team to scatter and try to evade the search parties independently. If anyone was captured, they were to stick to the basic cover story. They were a lost patrol conducting routine security operations near the border. Under no circumstances should they reveal the true nature of their intelligence-gathering mission. The team split up immediately, with each soldier heading in a different direction to confuse any pursuit. Sarah found herself alone for the first time since the mission began, carrying vital intelligence photographs and facing the terrifying prospect of navigating 60 miles of hostile territory without support. She could hear voices shouting in Pashto behind her as she scrambled up a steep rocky slope, trying to put distance between herself and the search area. Her pack seemed to grow heavier with each step, and she knew that she would have to make difficult decisions about what equipment to abandon if she hoped to survive the journey ahead. The sounds of pursuit faded gradually as Sarah climbed higher into the mountains. She paused to catch her breath and assess her situation. Her GPS unit showed that she was approximately 58 miles from the nearest coalition base, with rugged mountain terrain between her current position and safety. She had enough food for perhaps 2 more days and water for less than 1 day, depending on how carefully she rationed her supplies. Sarah studied her map by the faint glow of a red-filtered flashlight, trying to identify potential water sources and routes that would keep her away from populated areas where Taliban sympathizers might spot her. The mountain peaks around her rose to over 10,000 feet, and she knew that crossing them would test every limit of her physical and mental endurance. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her ordeal. She would attempt to reach coalition forces on foot, traveling primarily at night and hiding during daylight hours. The alternative was to remain hidden and hope for rescue, but with no working communication equipment and no way to signal her location, that option seemed like a death sentence. She began the long walk home just as the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, casting golden light across a landscape that held both breathtaking beauty and mortal danger. Behind her lay the compound where her team had gathered crucial intelligence, and ahead stretched miles of hostile territory that she would have to cross alone. The weight of the intelligence photographs in her pack reminded her that failure was not an option. Too many lives depended on the information reaching coalition headquarters. Sarah had never felt more alone in her life, but she had also never been more determined to survive. The training and experience that had brought her to this moment would now be tested against the harsh realities of survival behind enemy lines. She took her first step toward home, knowing that each mile would bring new challenges and that her survival would depend on courage, intelligence, and an unbreakable will to live. The morning air was crisp and thin at the high altitude, making each breath more difficult as she climbed toward the mountain pass that her map indicated was the most direct route toward friendly territory. Sarah had calculated that maintaining a pace of approximately 3 miles per hour during night movements would allow her to cover 15 to 20 miles each night, potentially reaching safety within 3 to 4 days if she could avoid detection and find water sources along the way. Her military training had prepared her for survival situations, but The reality of being alone in hostile territory was more psychologically challenging than any classroom exercise had suggested. Every sound in the wilderness around her could represent a threat, from Taliban patrols to wild animals that inhabited these remote mountains. Sarah forced herself to focus on immediate challenges rather than dwelling on the magnitude of her situation. The intelligence photographs tucked securely in her pack represented not just her mission objective, but potentially the key to saving hundreds of coalition lives in future operations. The compound they had observed was clearly a major enemy stronghold, and the information about its defenses and the leadership figures who used it could be crucial for military planners. This knowledge gave Sarah additional motivation to survive her ordeal and complete her mission. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah began looking for a hiding place where she could rest during the daylight hours. She found a small cave formed by fallen rocks on the north face of the mountain, offering concealment from observation while providing a clear view of the valley below. She settled into the rocky shelter, using her pack as a backrest, and tried to get some sleep despite the adrenaline and fear that continued to course through her system. Sarah woke to the sound of helicopters in the distance. The sun had moved across the sky, indicating that she had slept for several hours despite her intention to remain alert. The helicopter noise filled her with both hope and terror. It could be a coalition search and rescue mission looking for her team, or it could be Taliban forces using captured aircraft to hunt for survivors. She pressed herself deeper into the rocky crevice and listened carefully to the sound of the rotors. Her trained ear told her that these were likely Soviet-era aircraft, the kind commonly used by Taliban forces and other insurgent groups in the region. The helicopters circled the area for nearly an hour, occasionally hovering over specific locations as if the crews were investigating potential hiding spots. When the aircraft finally moved away toward the south, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and despair. Relief that she had not been discovered, but despair at the realization that her enemies were actively hunting for her with significant resources. The helicopter search suggested that the Taliban knew coalition forces had been operating in the area and were determined to find any survivors from her team. Sarah's thoughts turned to her teammates. She wondered if any of them had been captured, wounded, or killed during the chaotic escape from the Taliban search parties. The uncertainty was almost harder to bear than her own dangerous situation. These men had become like brothers to her over the months they had served together, and not knowing their fate created a constant ache in her chest. As darkness approached, Sarah prepared to continue her journey toward friendly lines. She had rationed her water carefully during the day, taking only small sips when absolutely necessary, but she knew that dehydration would become a critical problem within the next 24 hours unless she could find a reliable water source. Her map indicated a stream approximately 8 miles ahead, but reaching it would require crossing through a valley that might be patrolled by enemy forces. The night movement proved even more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks that threatened to send her tumbling down steep slopes in the darkness. Despite her night vision equipment, navigating safely required extreme caution and significantly slowed her progress. By dawn, she estimated that she had covered only about 12 miles, falling short of her planned pace. More troubling was the complete absence of any water sources along her route. The stream marked on her map had apparently dried up, leaving only a sandy depression where water had once flowed. Sarah's water supply was now critically low, with perhaps 6 hours of hydration remaining if she continued to ration strictly. The mathematics of survival were becoming stark and unforgiving. The second day of hiding proved to be a test of psychological endurance as much as physical survival. Taliban patrols passed through the valley below her hiding spot 3 times, each group consisting of 6 to 8 heavily armed fighters. Sarah watched them through her binoculars, noting their search patterns and trying to predict which routes might be safer for her continued movement. During the afternoon, she observed something that made her blood run cold. One of the patrols was accompanied by a man in civilian clothes who appeared to be a tracker, possibly a local guide hired to help locate the missing American soldiers. The tracker studied the ground carefully, occasionally pointing out features to the Taliban fighters that suggested he had found signs of recent passage through the area. The presence of an experienced tracker dramatically increased the danger of Sarah's situation. While she had been careful to minimize her trail, completely eliminating all traces of her movement through the wilderness was nearly impossible. A skilled tracker might be able to follow her route and predict her destination, potentially allowing Taliban forces to set up ambushes along her projected path. Sarah made the difficult decision to abandon her planned route and head directly into the most rugged mountain terrain, where tracking would be more difficult, but where the physical challenges would be extreme. This detour would add at least 2 days to her journey and would take her away from any potential water sources marked on her map, but it might be her only chance to avoid capture. As the sun set on her second day alone, Sarah felt the early stages of serious dehydration beginning to affect her judgment and physical coordination. Her mouth was painfully dry, and she had developed a severe headache that made concentration difficult. She knew from her survival training that she was entering the danger zone where poor decision-making could quickly lead to disaster. The night movement became a nightmare of physical and mental challenges. Sarah found herself stumbling frequently, and her night vision equipment seemed less effective as her dehydration worsened. Several times she had to stop and rest, fighting against the urge to drink her remaining water all at once rather than continuing to ration it carefully. Around midnight, Sarah's luck finally changed. She heard the sound of running water echoing off the rocky walls of a narrow canyon she was traversing. Following the sound, she discovered a small spring feeding into a pool no bigger than a bathtub, but filled with clear, cold mountain water. Sarah nearly cried with relief as she refilled her water bottles and drank deeply for the first time in 2 days. The spring was a gift that probably saved her life, but it also presented new challenges. The water source was located in an area where enemy patrols might also come to refill their supplies, making it potentially dangerous to linger. Sarah filled every container she had with water, including an empty MRE pouch, giving her enough hydration for several more days of travel. Refreshed and rehydrated, Sarah was able to make better progress during the remaining hours of darkness. She climbed steadily toward a high mountain pass that would take her across the main ridge line and into a valley that led more directly toward coalition territory. The altitude made breathing difficult, but the thin air also meant that she was less likely to encounter enemy patrols in such remote terrain. Dawn found Sarah at nearly 11,000 feet elevation, higher than she had ever been in her life. The view from a mountain pass was spectacular, with snow-capped peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction. More importantly, she could see the valley system that led toward her objective, though the distance still appeared daunting. The high-altitude hiding spot offered excellent security, but the cold was becoming a serious problem. Sarah had not packed extreme cold weather gear, expecting to spend most of her time at lower elevations. As the temperature dropped with the rising altitude and the approach of winter weather, she found herself shivering uncontrollably despite wearing every layer of clothing she carried. During the third day, Sarah observed weather patterns that suggested a storm system was approaching from the west. Dark clouds were building over the mountain peaks, and the wind was beginning to pick up significantly. She knew that being caught in a high-altitude storm without proper shelter could be fatal, but descending to lower elevations would put her back in areas where she might encounter Taliban patrols. The decision was made for her when the first snow began falling around noon. The flakes were large and wet, quickly accumulating on the rocky surfaces around her hiding place. Sarah realized that she would have to descend immediately or risk being trapped by the storm in terrain where survival would be impossible. The descent from the mountain pass became a race against time and weather. The snow was making the rocky surfaces slippery and dangerous, and visibility was decreasing rapidly as the storm intensified. Sarah had to abandon some of her equipment to move more quickly, keeping only the essential items needed for survival and the intelligence photographs that represented her mission objective. Several times during the descent, Sarah nearly fell as loose rocks gave way under the accumulating snow. Her hands were numb with cold, making it difficult to grip her ice axe and maintain control during the treacherous climb down the mountain face. The storm was turning into a full blizzard, with wind gusts that threatened to blow her off exposed ledges. By late afternoon, Sarah had descended to about 8,000 feet, where the snow was mixed with freezing rain that soaked through her clothing and chilled her to the bone. She was showing early signs of hypothermia, with uncontrollable shivering and difficulty thinking clearly about her situation. Finding shelter became her immediate priority, more important even than avoiding enemy detection. Sarah discovered a small cave formed by an overhanging rock formation, barely large enough for one person, but offering protection from the wind and precipitation. She crawled inside and tried to warm herself by doing isometric exercises and consuming one of her remaining energy bars. The cave was cramped and uncomfortable, but it potentially saved her life by providing refuge from the storm. The blizzard continued through the night, trapping Sarah in her rocky shelter while the temperature dropped well below freezing. She dozed fitfully, waking frequently to exercise her extremities and prevent frostbite. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape covered in several inches of fresh snow. The snow created new challenges for Sarah's continued journey. Her tracks would now be clearly visible to any pursuers, and the white landscape would make her dark military clothing stand out dramatically. She used her emergency space blanket to create a crude white camouflage poncho, but she knew that her movement would still be relatively easy to track across the snowy terrain. More concerning was the realization that the snowfall would make finding food sources much more difficult. Sarah had been supplementing her emergency rations with edible plants and roots that she identified along her route, but these were now buried under snow. Her food supply was running critically low, with perhaps 2 days of nutrition remaining if she continued to ration carefully. The fourth day began with another difficult decision about route selection. The storm had made the high mountain routes nearly impassable, but the lower valleys where travel would be easier were also the areas most likely to be patrolled by enemy forces. Sarah chose a middle route along the mountainsides, accepting slower progress in exchange for better security. During the morning movement, Sarah noticed that she was beginning to experience the physical effects of prolonged stress and inadequate nutrition. Her endurance was noticeably reduced, and she found herself needing to rest more frequently. The combination of high altitude, cold weather, limited food, and constant psychological stress was taking a cumulative toll on her body and mind. Around midday, Sarah encountered evidence that she was not alone in the mountains. She discovered the remains of a small campfire that appeared to be only a few days old, along with footprints in the snow that suggested a group of 5 or 6 people had passed through the area recently. The tracks could belong to Taliban fighters, local smugglers, or even other coalition forces operating in the region. Sarah studied the campsite carefully, looking for clues about who had been there and which direction they had traveled. The footprints led both east and west from the camp, suggesting that the group had split up or that multiple groups were using this location as a waypoint. She found several cigarette butts and empty food containers that suggested Middle Eastern origin, increasing the likelihood that Taliban forces had used this camp. The discovery of recent enemy activity in her immediate area forced Sarah to reconsider her route once again. She was now behind schedule for reaching friendly lines, and her supplies were running dangerously low. The psychological pressure of constant vigilance was becoming harder to maintain, and she found herself making small mistakes in navigation and camouflage that could prove fatal if she encountered enemy forces. That evening, as Sarah prepared for another night of movement, she faced the sobering realization that her mission might not succeed. The combination of hostile forces, harsh weather, difficult terrain, and dwindling supplies created a survival equation that seemed almost impossible to solve. However, the thought of her fallen teammates and The critical intelligence she carried continued to drive her forward when her body wanted to give up. The intelligence photographs tucked securely in her waterproof pouch represented more than just military information. They were proof that her team's sacrifice had meaning and that their dangerous mission had accomplished its objectives. Sarah knew that reaching friendly lines would not only save her own life, but would also ensure that her teammates' courage and sacrifice would contribute to saving other lives in future operations. As darkness fell on her fourth night alone in the mountains, Sarah set out once again toward home, driven by determination that had been forged in the crucible of survival. Each step forward was a victory against the odds, and each mile covered brought her closer to completing a mission that had already cost so much. The mountains around her held both beauty and danger in equal measure, but Sarah had learned to navigate both with the skills and courage that defined her as a soldier and as a survivor. The fifth morning brought Sarah face to face with her most dangerous challenge yet. As she crested a rocky ridge, she found herself looking down into a valley where a Taliban checkpoint controlled the only viable route through the mountain pass. The checkpoint consisted of several armed guards, 2 pickup trucks with mounted machine guns, and what appeared to be a communication setup that could summon reinforcements quickly if needed. Sarah studied the checkpoint through her binoculars for over an hour, noting the patterns of guard rotation and activity levels throughout the early morning hours. The Taliban fighters appeared relaxed and confident, suggesting they didn't expect any coalition forces to be operating in the area. However, their position completely blocked the most direct route toward friendly territory, forcing Sarah to consider either a dangerous detour or an extremely risky attempt to bypass the checkpoint. The detour would add at least 3 days to her journey, taking her through terrain that her map indicated might be impassable in current weather conditions. More critically, she no longer had enough food or water to sustain herself for an additional 3 days of travel. Her remaining supplies consisted of 1 energy bar, half a packet of crackers, and approximately 16 ounces of water, enough for perhaps 12 hours of continued movement. Sarah's military training had included techniques for bypassing enemy positions, but those exercises had always assumed the support of a team and proper equipment for the mission. Attempting to sneak past the checkpoint alone, in broad daylight, while weakened by days of inadequate nutrition and sleep, represented a level of risk that bordered on suicidal. Yet the alternatives seemed equally hopeless. The checkpoint was positioned at the narrowest point of the valley, where steep cliffs rose on both sides of the road. The Taliban fighters had chosen their location well, creating a bottleneck that would be difficult for even a well-equipped military unit to bypass undetected. For a single soldier on foot, carrying minimal equipment, the challenge appeared almost insurmountable. Sarah spent the morning conducting detailed reconnaissance of the checkpoint and surrounding terrain, looking for any weakness in the enemy's defensive setup. She identified a narrow goat trail that wound along the eastern cliff face, potentially offering a route around the checkpoint if she could navigate it successfully. The trail appeared to be carved into the rock face itself, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet to the valley floor below. The decision to attempt the cliff route was made easier by the discovery that Taliban reinforcements were arriving at the checkpoint during the afternoon. 2 additional vehicles brought nearly a dozen more fighters to the position, along with additional heavy weapons, and what appeared to be a radio operator who immediately began setting up an improved communications array. The increased enemy presence made any attempt to sneak through the valley floor virtually impossible. Sarah waited until late afternoon before beginning her approach to the cliff trail. The setting sun would be in the eyes of any guards looking eastward, potentially masking her movement against the rock face. She cached all non-essential equipment at her observation post, keeping only her water, remaining food, weapon, ammunition, and the crucial intelligence photographs. The beginning of the cliff traverse was terrifying, but manageable. The goat trail was narrow, but clearly defined, apparently used regularly by local herders to move their animals between grazing areas. Sarah moved slowly and carefully, testing each foothold before committing her full weight to it. The drop below her was dizzying, but she forced herself not to look down and instead focused on the trail immediately ahead. About halfway across the cliff face, the trail became much more challenging. Weather erosion had washed away sections of the path, leaving gaps that had to be crossed by careful climbing moves on the vertical rock face. Sarah's hands were numb with cold and fear, making it difficult to maintain her grip on the rough stone surface. Several times she nearly slipped, catching herself at the last moment through pure determination and adrenaline. The most dangerous moment came when Sarah disturbed a loose rock that clattered down the cliff face toward the valley below. She froze against the stone wall, praying that the guards would not investigate the source of the noise. She could hear voices calling in Pashto from the checkpoint, and for several minutes there was increased activity as the Taliban fighters tried to determine what had caused the disturbance. Eventually the guards settled back into their routine, apparently concluding that the falling rock was natural rather than caused by human activity. Sarah waited another 30 minutes before continuing her traverse, moving even more carefully to avoid creating any additional noise. Her muscles were cramping from the stress of clinging to the rock face for extended periods, but she forced herself to maintain concentration and technique. As darkness fell, Sarah finally reached the western end of the cliff trail, having successfully bypassed the Taliban checkpoint. She was physically and emotionally exhausted from the harrowing traverse, but the relief of avoiding capture gave her renewed energy for the continued journey. The valley on the western side of the checkpoint was empty and peaceful, offering her the first sense of security she had felt in days. Sarah allowed herself a brief celebration of her success before focusing on the challenges that still lay ahead. Her GPS unit indicated that she was now approximately 25 miles from the nearest coalition forward operating base, but the terrain between her current position and safety remained difficult and potentially hostile. She had perhaps 8 hours of remaining hydration and only a few bites of food left to sustain her for what could be another 2 days of travel. The night movement after the cliff traverse proved to be among the most difficult of Sarah's entire ordeal. The emotional and physical stress of the dangerous bypass had depleted her energy reserves, and she found herself stumbling frequently as she navigated the rocky terrain in darkness. Her night vision equipment was beginning to show signs of battery failure, flickering occasionally and reducing the clarity of the display. More concerning was Sarah's growing awareness that her judgment was becoming impaired by hunger, dehydration, and sleep deprivation. She caught herself making navigational errors and having to backtrack to correct her route. The cumulative effects of her ordeal were reaching a critical point where continued survival would depend on reaching friendly forces within the next 24 hours. Around midnight, Sarah encountered a problem that threatened to end her journey immediately. She came to a fast-moving stream that had to be crossed to continue toward her objective, but the water was too deep and cold to wade across safely in her weakened condition. The current was strong enough to sweep away anyone who lost their footing, and the water temperature would cause rapid hypothermia for anyone immersed in it. Sarah spent over an hour searching for a safe crossing point, becoming increasingly desperate as she realized that this natural barrier might be insurmountable in her current state. Finally, she discovered a fallen tree that bridged the stream about a quarter-mile upstream from her initial crossing attempt. The tree trunk was wet and slippery from the stream spray, but it offered her only viable option for getting across the water. The stream crossing became another test of courage and balance that pushed Sarah to her physical limits. She crawled across the fallen tree on her hands and knees, fighting against exhaustion and vertigo as the sound of rushing water filled her ears. Halfway across, she slipped and nearly fell into the stream, catching herself by hooking her elbow around a broken branch and pulling herself back onto the trunk through sheer force of will. When Sarah finally reached the far side of the stream, she collapsed on the rocky shore and allowed herself to rest for the first time in hours. Her hands were cut and bleeding from gripping the rough bark of the tree, and her clothing was soaked from the stream spray. Despite the discomfort, she felt a surge of pride at overcoming another seemingly impossible obstacle through determination and skill. The dawn of her sixth day alone brought both hope and new challenges. Sarah's GPS showed that she had made significant progress during the night and was now within approximately 15 miles of friendly forces. However, her physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. She had consumed the last of her food during the previous evening, and her water supply was nearly exhausted despite careful rationing. The terrain ahead appeared to offer easier travel, with gentler slopes and what looked like established trails that might allow faster movement. However, the improved terrain also meant that she was approaching areas where she might encounter enemy patrols or local civilians who could report her presence to Taliban forces. The final stretch of her journey would require careful balance between speed and stealth. During the morning, Sarah began to experience hallucinations and disorientation that she recognized as signs of severe exhaustion and malnutrition. Several times, she thought she heard helicopter rotors or vehicle engines, only to realize that the sounds existed only in her mind. She forced herself to stop and rest frequently, fighting against the urge to push forward recklessly in her eagerness to reach safety. Around noon, Sarah encountered a dirt road that appeared to lead in the direction of her objective. The road offered much easier travel than the mountain trails, but it also represented a significant risk if enemy forces used it for transportation or patrols. After studying the road through her binoculars for 30 minutes and seeing no signs of activity, Sarah decided to follow it while maintaining careful watch for approaching vehicles. The improved pace on the road surface was a welcome relief after days of difficult mountain travel. Sarah was able to cover several miles in just a few hours, bringing her tantalizingly close to her objective. However, the exposure of traveling on an open road made her extremely nervous, and she remained ready to dive for cover in the ditches that ran alongside the route. Late in the afternoon, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles coming from behind her on the road. She immediately left the road surface and concealed herself in the sparse vegetation nearby, watching as two pickup trucks loaded with Taliban fighters drove past her hiding spot. The fighters appeared to be conducting a routine patrol rather than actively searching for her, but their presence confirmed that the road was actively used by enemy forces. The close encounter with the Taliban patrol forced Sarah to abandon the road and return to cross-country travel for the final portion of her journey. The detour added distance and difficulty to her route, but it was far safer than continuing to use transportation routes that were obviously monitored by enemy forces. She estimated that she was now within 8 to 10 miles of friendly lines, close enough that rescue was possible, but still far enough that failure remained a real possibility. As evening approached, Sarah faced the reality that she was reaching the absolute limits of her endurance. She had been without food for over 18 hours and was down to her last few ounces of water. Her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy, and she was experiencing periods of confusion and disorientation that made navigation increasingly difficult. The intelligence photographs that had sustained her motivation throughout the ordeal remained secure in their waterproof container, a constant reminder of why her mission was so important. Sarah knew that the information she carried could be crucial for future operations and potentially save hundreds of lives. This knowledge continued to drive her forward when her body wanted to give up. The final night movement of Sarah's journey became a race against time and her body's failing resources. She was no longer able to maintain her previous pace, stopping frequently to rest and fighting against the overwhelming urge to simply lie down and sleep. Her training and willpower were all that kept her moving toward her objective as her physical systems began to fail. Around midnight, Sarah thought she saw lights in the distance that might indicate the presence of a coalition base. However, her impaired judgment made it difficult to determine whether the lights were real or another hallucination brought on by her deteriorating condition. She forced herself to continue moving toward the lights, knowing that they represented either salvation or a cruel trick of her exhausted mind. As she struggled forward through the darkness, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. She had survived behind enemy lines for 6 days, covering over 50 miles of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth while avoiding capture by determined enemy forces. The experience had tested every aspect of her training and character, revealing reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. The lights in the distance grew gradually brighter as Sarah approached, giving her hope that they might represent real rather than imagined sources of illumination. Her heart raced with anticipation as she considered the possibility that her ordeal might finally be coming to an end, but she forced herself to remain cautious and alert until she could definitively confirm that she had reached safety. The lights that Sarah had been struggling toward throughout the night proved to be real, emanating from Forward Operating Base Chapman, a small coalition outpost positioned on a strategic hilltop overlooking the border region. As dawn broke on her 7th day alone, Sarah found herself looking at the perimeter defenses of the base from a distance of approximately 1 mile. The sight of American flags and familiar military vehicles filled her with overwhelming relief and emotion. However, Sarah's ordeal was not yet over. Approaching a military base while dressed in combat gear and carrying weapons required extreme caution, even when the base belonged to friendly forces. Sentries would be trained to shoot first and ask questions later when dealing with unidentified personnel approaching the perimeter, especially in an area known for Taliban infiltration attempts and suicide attacks. Sarah spent the early morning hours observing the base through her binoculars, studying the guard positions, and trying to identify the safest approach route. She needed to make contact with the sentries in a way that would clearly identify her as a friendly coalition soldier rather than a potential threat. Her voice was hoarse from days of limited water intake, and she wasn't sure she could shout loudly enough to be heard from a safe distance. The base's perimeter was protected by multiple layers of defensive obstacles, including razor wire, watchtowers, and what appeared to be automated detection systems. Sarah could see guards manning the towers and patrolling the perimeter, maintaining the high level of alertness necessary in such a dangerous area. She realized that approaching the base would require the same careful planning and execution that had characterized her entire journey. Around 0800 hours, Sarah noticed increased activity at the base as helicopters began landing and taking off in the helicopter landing zone inside the perimeter. The sight of the aircraft reminded her of her original extraction point and the team members whose fate remained unknown. She wondered if any of her teammates had managed to reach safety, or if she was the sole survivor of the failed mission. Sarah decided to approach the main gate of the base, reasoning that the guards there would be best trained to handle contact with friendly forces under unusual circumstances. She removed her helmet and raised her hands above her head before beginning to walk slowly toward the gate, stopping frequently to allow the guards time to observe her and assess her intentions. When she was approximately 200 meters from a gate, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of multiple weapons being aimed in her direction. A voice speaking accented English called out through a loudspeaker, demanding that she stop and identify herself. Sarah complied immediately, shouting back that she was Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, returning from a reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines. The response from the gate guards was immediate and professional. Additional soldiers emerged from defensive positions while maintaining their weapons trained on Sarah, and an officer approached cautiously to conduct a preliminary identification and threat assessment. Sarah remained motionless with her hands visible, following all the procedures for contact with friendly forces that she had learned in training. The officer who approached her was a young lieutenant whose name tape read Patterson. He moved with the cautious professionalism of someone who had been in combat before, keeping his weapon ready while maintaining a respectful but firm tone during the initial contact. Sarah identified herself again and provided her service number, unit designation, and the code name for her classified mission. Lieutenant Patterson's demeanor changed immediately when Sarah mentioned the mission code name. He spoke rapidly into his radio headset, apparently contacting higher-level command personnel who could verify her credentials and mission status. Within minutes, additional officers had arrived at the gate, including the base commander, Colonel Roberts, who had been briefed on Sarah's missing reconnaissance team. The verification process took nearly an hour as military intelligence personnel confirmed Sarah's identity and mission authorization through encrypted communications with higher headquarters. During this time, Sarah was allowed to sit in the shade of the guard post while medics provided her with water and began assessing her physical condition. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and exhausted, but apparently free of serious injuries despite her week-long ordeal. Colonel Roberts personally conducted Sarah's debrief once her identity had been confirmed. He was a career infantry officer with multiple combat deployments, and his experience showed in his thorough but compassionate approach to gathering information about Sarah's mission and the fate of her team. Sarah provided a complete account of the mission, from the initial insertion to her solo journey to the base. The intelligence photographs that Sarah had carried through her entire ordeal proved to be even more valuable than originally anticipated. The images showed not only the Taliban compound that had been the original target, but also provided evidence of a much larger enemy operation in the region. Military intelligence analysts who examined the photographs immediately recognized several high-value targets and identified weapons and equipment that suggested direct foreign support for Taliban operations. Colonel Roberts informed Sarah that her team's sacrifice had not been in vain. The intelligence they had gathered was already being used to plan a major operation that would target the entire Taliban network in the region. However, he also delivered the devastating news that Sarah had feared throughout her journey. She was the only survivor of her reconnaissance team. The other 4 members had been killed during the escape attempt or captured and executed by Taliban forces. The news of her teammates' deaths hit Sarah harder than all the physical challenges she had endured during her journey. Staff Sergeant Thompson, Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Johnson, and Private First Class Williams had been more than just fellow soldiers. They had been friends and brothers who had trusted each other with their lives. Learning that her survival had come at the cost of their deaths created a burden of survivor's guilt that would stay with her for years. Medical personnel at the base conducted a thorough examination of Sarah's condition and determined that she had lost nearly 20 pounds during her week alone in the mountains. She was suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and exhaustion, but had avoided any life-threatening medical conditions through careful resource management and sheer determination. Her feet were badly blistered and cut from the difficult terrain, and she had several minor injuries from her cliff traverse, but nothing that wouldn't heal with proper treatment. The psychological evaluation was more complex. Military psychiatrists recognized that Sarah was experiencing the early stages of post-traumatic stress, particularly related to survivor's guilt and the extreme stress of her solo journey. However, they also noted her remarkable psychological resilience and credited her military training and personal character with enabling her survival under conditions that would have broken many people. Within 48 hours of reaching the base, Sarah was evacuated by helicopter to a major medical facility for comprehensive treatment and evaluation. The flight took her over much of the terrain she had covered on foot, providing a perspective on her journey that was both humbling and awe-inspiring. From the air, the mountain passes and valleys looked even more formidable than they had seemed during her ground movement. The medical facility provided Sarah with the best possible care for both her physical and psychological recovery. Nutritionists worked to restore her body weight and strength through carefully planned diet and exercise programs, while psychologists helped her process the trauma of losing her teammates and surviving alone behind enemy lines. The recovery process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but Sarah was determined to return to full duty as soon as medically possible. During her recovery, Sarah learned that the intelligence she had risked her life to obtain had been used in a successful operation that eliminated the Taliban compound and captured or killed dozens of enemy fighters. The operation also disrupted a major weapons smuggling network and dealt a significant blow to Taliban operations in the region. Military commanders estimated that the intelligence Sarah had gathered would save hundreds of coalition lives by preventing future attacks. Sarah was awarded the Silver Star for her extraordinary heroism and determination in completing her mission under impossible circumstances. The citation specifically recognized her courage in carrying vital intelligence through 57 miles of hostile territory while evading enemy forces and surviving in extreme conditions. However, Sarah felt that any recognition should be shared with her fallen teammates, whose sacrifice had made the mission's success possible. The most meaningful recognition for Sarah came from the families of soldiers whose lives were saved by the intelligence she had gathered. Letters and visits from parents, spouses, and children of coalition forces reminded her that her survival and successful completion of the mission had very real consequences for people she would never meet. This knowledge helped Sarah cope with the survivor's guilt and find meaning in her traumatic experience. Sarah's story became part of military training curricula, used to teach survival techniques and the importance of mission completion under extreme circumstances. Her experience demonstrated that even when everything goes wrong, proper training, determination, and courage can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Military instructors used her case study to emphasize that individual soldiers can make a crucial difference in the success of larger operations. The physical scars from Sarah's ordeal healed relatively quickly, but the psychological impact took much longer to process. She struggled with nightmares and anxiety related to her time alone in the mountains, and she found it difficult to form close relationships with new team members after losing the soldiers who had been like brothers to her. However, with time and professional help, Sarah gradually learned to manage these challenges while continuing to serve her country. Sarah returned to active duty 6 months after her rescue. Though she was initially assigned to training and support roles rather than frontline combat operations, her experience made her an invaluable instructor for survival and evasion training, and she took pride in preparing other soldiers for the kinds of challenges she had faced. She found that teaching others helped her process her own experiences while contributing to the safety and preparedness of future missions. The compound that had been the target of Sarah's original mission was completely destroyed in the follow-up operation, and several senior Taliban commanders were eliminated or captured. The weapons and equipment that Sarah had photographed were traced back to their sources, leading to additional operations that further disrupted enemy supply lines. The ripple effects of her successful mission continued for months after her rescue. Years later, Sarah reflected on the week she spent alone in the Afghan mountains as a defining experience that revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The journey had tested every aspect of her training and character, but it had also demonstrated the power of human determination and the importance of never giving up in the face of overwhelming odds. She had walked home against all odds, carrying with her not just intelligence that saved lives, but also a deeper understanding of what it means to serve with honor and courage. Sarah's story became a testament to the dedication and sacrifice of military personnel who risk everything to protect others. Her week-long journey through hostile territory represented more than just individual survival. It symbolized the unwavering commitment of soldiers to complete their missions regardless of personal cost. The intelligence photographs she had safeguarded through her ordeal were more than just military information. They were proof that courage and determination could triumph over the most difficult circumstances. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested Sarah Mitchell in ways she never could have imagined, but they had also forged her into a symbol of resilience and dedication that would inspire others for years to come. Her walk home had been measured in miles of hostile terrain, but it had been powered by the unbreakable spirit of a soldier who refused to abandon her mission or her fallen comrades. Against all odds, she had succeeded in both surviving and serving, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, hope and heroism can prevail. The final chapter of Sarah's story was not her rescue, but rather what she chose to do with the experience afterward. She dedicated herself to honoring the memory of her fallen teammates while using her survival story to improve training and preparation for other soldiers. Her journey had ended safely at Forward Operating Base Chapman, but Her impact on military culture and training continued long after she had returned home. Sarah Mitchell had not just survived against all odds. She had used her survival to make a difference in the lives of countless others who would face similar challenges in defense of their country.